Thanks, Ed. Don't make me come up there.
My name's Brad, I'm an alcoholic. Wayne's always getting beat night of beers on warm summer nights with outline shorts and Hawaiian flower shirts. So if you noticed tonight's Pete's wearing shorts, and I wore one of those shirts. I can't resist the urge tonight because of a somewhat smaller crowd to tell a joke to start with. And this joke is about, there's this real estate recruiter that ran an ad in the newspaper and spent a lot of money on this ad and had his real estate office all set up for this big crowd who was going to show up and find out about the career in real estate. And he had coffee there and donuts for everybody. And it was supposed to start at 7 o'clock, and at 7 o'clock he moved in, and there was just one person sitting in his boardroom, so we went away for a few minutes and came back. And at 10 after 7, looked again, there's still just one person sitting there, so we walked in. And here's this great big old farmer sitting there in bib overalls, leaning back in his chair. The real estate recruiter walks in and says, "You know, I think I'm going to have to cancel tonight because we don't have anybody here." And the farmer leans back and he says, "You know, when I go out in the field in the morning to feed the cows, if just one cow shows up, I still feed her." So the real estate recruiter leans his head down and goes, "Well, okay, you got it." So the way he goes and starts out, and it's a hot night just like this, and he's got his arms waving around, he's doing this thing, trying to convince this guy that this is just the best thing since sliced bread, that this guy should get into real estate. Pretty soon he's got his jacket off, and a little while later his tie comes off, and his sleeves are rolled up, and the sweat's pouring down, and he's working away on this guy. And about an hour and a half later, he says, "That's it." I said, "I'm done. What do you think?" And the farmer looks at him and leans back and says, "You know, when I go to the field in the morning to feed the cows, if just one cow comes down, I still feed her, but I don't give her the whole load." Now, unfortunately for you guys, I'm a little bit more like the recruiter than like the farmer. You're going to get the whole load, even though there is a small crowd listening. Whenever I'm working with a sponsee, we're doing great treatment, and then you get to step 8, the response is almost always the same. "You want me to do what?" Let me get this straight. I had to do a fearless and searching moral inventory. Then I had to tell somebody all the horrible things that I've done. And now you want me to apologize to them all? To which I say, no, that's step 9. I just want you to make a list and become willing to make amends. Oh, and by the way, apologizing and making amends aren't necessarily the same thing. Amends can be a lot worse. So how do you like me now? When I spoke last month on step 7, I talked about sitting out there and listening to Wayne talk about God's unconditional, radical, and relentless love for each of us. And the fact that God loved us right where we are, but loved us too much to leave us there. I would look around and see all the lucky people Wayne was talking about, because deep down inside I knew he wasn't talking about me. You see, by the time most of us get here and get to the point of admitting that we have a problem, we're also at the point where we don't think anybody could love us or forgive us. We often hear, "If you knew who I was or what I've done, you wouldn't want anything to do with me." By the time I had arrived here and arrived at the conclusion I had a problem, my marriage was over and my kids had given up on me. At least that's what had happened in my mind. It was proof to me that people who knew me wouldn't want anything to do with me. I believe this to the very depth of my soul. What I've since discovered is that they loved me so much that they had to release me to my own journey, even though it was the hardest thing in the world for them to do. So believing that nobody could love me up until the time I was able to get honest with myself, I worked really hard at being something or somebody other than myself. I would be whatever you wanted me to be. I had more masks than I had clothes. Being whatever you want me to be is really hard work. And it robs me of the chance to be what God intended me to be. And as I have come to understand, this plan is always better than mine. I also found out something else. When I was able to get real and admit that I wasn't somebody else, and that I had flaws, and that I had made lots of mistakes, and that I had hurt people, instead of running away, people actually drew closer to me. It doesn't matter how bad you think you've been, or how far down you think you have fallen. People relate to your humanness, to your beingness, not to your masks. I believe this is for two reasons. One, it helps them to relate to their own wounds, and two, it gives them permission to talk about themselves. So now, for the first few years I'm in the program, learning the steps and running around like a chicken with my head cut off trying to fix everything. Apparently, I couldn't see the numbers that appeared at the start of each step that kind of put them in some kind of order, possibly an order that was supposed to be followed. Thinking I had step 3 down pat, I quickly took my own bill, made a short list of people who I knew I needed to apologize to, and headed out to make myself feel better. If you haven't started doing your amends yet, I'm not recommending this way of doing it. So now, after trying to make a few amends, which didn't go too well, I'm back to feeling kind of crappy about myself. Always quick to blame somebody or something else and look for an easy or soft way, I start thinking, surely this program doesn't work. But I had pretty much exhausted all other options, so I kept coming back, and after a while, I started to get it. Do step 1, then step 2, then step 3, and so on. And by the time I got to step 8, working with my sponsor, I'd learned how to do it properly. Step 8 makes a lot of us cower in fear and we make declarations like, yeah, but he started it. Or I can't make amends to this person or to that person. Keep in mind that step 8 is just about making a list and becoming willing to make amends. We have to eventually get to step 9. And here's how important these 2 steps are. Do you have the scripture ready for me back there? So this scripture is Jesus speaking to the people in the Sermon on the Mount.
That's better.
He says, so if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar. Go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your sacrifice to God. So when we take a look at that, Jesus is saying, if you are in the temple, if you are in church offering a sacrifice, it's more important that you go and make your amends and be reconciled to that person than it is to be there in church. So my alcoholic mind, when I look at this, I go, oh, it's a good thing that I'm not living in a time where we have to make sacrifices. But in fact, we are, and we just did it in our step 3. We made a living sacrifice. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and do with me as thou wilt. My alcoholic mind also reads this scripture and says, suddenly remember that someone has something against you, and I go, well, that's his problem, not mine. But usually, when somebody has something against you, it's because of something that you've done. So again, keep in mind, this was so important way back when Jesus was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, that he said, you leave your sacrifice at the altar and go and make your amends. We can come up with all kinds of reasons and excuses why we can't make amends. They may be masked with their self-righteous anger towards another person. But most of all, at the root of all of the excuses lies fear. We fear that we have left too much wreckage to ever be repaired. First of all, it's not about fixing things. That may be a happy byproduct, but it's about cleaning up our side of the street. So our higher power thinks this is so important that if we think of anyone, we should drop whatever it is that we're doing and make amends or be reconciled to that person. And we are thinking that we are too broken, too wounded, too fearful, and not good enough to be able to do what God has in mind for us. But the whole Bible is about reconciliation. That's how important this step is. God uses people just like you and me to do this. Since the beginning, He has taken a pretty sorry bunch of characters to show us that. Liars, cheats, thieves, all manner of wounded, fearful, and somewhat unsavory people who He has favored and poured His grace onto to do His work. Let me tell you of a few who thought, just like I did, when I first came here thinking I was worthless, that they weren't good enough, and they had fallen out of favor with God. In the book of Genesis, Jacob, working closely with his mother, so talk about a dysfunctional family, hatched a plot to deceive his aging father. They lied to him and tricked him into giving his estate to Jacob instead of to his older brother Esau, essentially stealing Esau's birthright. Esau wasn't without his own worldliness, as he had given in to his need for instant gratification and accepted a bowl of stew for the rights to his extra inheritance. Family dinners were never quite the same in that family. If you want to read a story that rivals 50 Shades of Grey and Sex, Lies, and Videotape, follow Jacob's family through the Bible. Watch their shenanigans and you will see family favoritism, boundary crossing galore, abuse, denial, betrayal, sexual misconduct, and any number of character defects that would keep a family therapist in business for years, or actually generations. Their dysfunctional family carried on in an intergenerational pattern. But reconciliation and healing are also present in this story, as amends were made and then life changed dramatically. So how did God favor them, the family of Jacob, and show His unconditional love? Well, actually, quite dramatically. Judah, one of Jacob's sons, would head the royal line whose most famous descendant was Jesus. Now let's look at another one of my favorites, King David. I was looking at a website earlier this week, and it listed that King David's occupation as shepherd, warrior, and king of Israel. That's a pretty good resume. It would also be safe to say that David wrestled with a few demons. A great warrior who conquered many enemies in battle, David had problems conquering himself and his defects of character. One night of lust with Bathsheba had disastrous consequences for him. It was an adulterous affair because she was married to Uriah, a friend of David's, and she became pregnant. Anxious to save his own neck, David tried to cover it up, and rather than making amends, ultimately sent Uriah into battle, knowing that he would be killed. So among many other things, David struggled with lust, was a liar, an adulterer, and by proxy, a murderer. I could go on about David's defects, but enough of taking his inventory. I think you get the idea. Interestingly, God called David a man after his own heart, and God and David had a very close relationship. David was the father of the wise King Solomon and an ancestor of Jesus. Now let's fast forward, if we can in biblical times, to the New Testament. Saul, who later became Paul, had an interesting background. Paul was a Pharisee, one of the religious leaders who was actively persecuting and even participating in the killing of Christians until his conversion. Paul is a great example of doing a living amends. He devoted the rest of his life after his conversion to spreading the gospel, and he wrote about 2/3 of the New Testament. Paul was flawed like all of us, and wrote of his imperfections as an illustration of how we all struggle and how we never arrive at anything even closely resembling having it all together. Now, also in the New Testament is one of my favorite stories. In the book of Luke, Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son. This is a particularly beautiful story because it speaks so much to the heart of of us addicts. It is easy to see ourselves in the prodigal, which, by the way, means extravagantly wasted. Here's briefly how the story goes. The youngest of two sons asks his father for his inheritance early and leaves home looking for fast times and way more fun than hanging around the family farm doing chores. Like most of us do, he found it, or so he thought. After a period of wine, women, and song, he found himself financially, morally, and spiritually bankrupt and was eating with the pigs. Nowhere to turn, or so he thought, and seemingly powerless over his circumstances. In our language, he had hit bottom. In this predicament, we can easily see ourselves. Life becomes rather unmanageable, having given in to all of our desires in an attempt to escape reality. Chasing rainbows that we think are out there and not in here. So the prodigal came up with an idea to go home and to beg his father to let him be one of his servants, because they certainly were living a better life than he was. I love the notion or the analogy that at that moment he came to believe in a power greater than himself. This is the beauty of Jesus' parables. It's not emotion. It's exactly what Jesus was talking about. The prodigal, you and I, having turned away from our higher power, start to realize that we cannot do it on our own. And wait for it. Make a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand Him. Just like the prodigal. Then the prodigal, having done a fearless and searching moral inventory of himself, admitting his defects of character, at least getting a start on his list of people he needed to make amends to, heads off to make amends to his father. His father, seeing him coming down the road and having an ache in his heart because he had been missing his son so much, ran out to greet him. When the son started to say what he had rehearsed over and over in his mind to get his father to take him back, the father would have nothing to do. He threw his arms around him and welcomed him home. That is the way it is with our higher power. When we decide it is time to go home, he throws his arms around us and says, "You don't need to say anything. I've been waiting for you. Welcome home." The prodigal's father clothed him in the finest of garments, killed the fatted calf, and held a celebration. Now the oldest brother was not too pleased by the turn of events and harbored a deep resentment. If we look at this part of the story, we again can see ourselves. Often in recovery, we see those people who have turned their lives around and for whom the promises are starting to come true, and we can be like the oldest son. Sometimes we think, well, it happened to them, but it can never happen to me. And this part of the story can seem like a real downer to an otherwise happy ending. But, as always, Jesus' parables always have a point. You see, the father didn't love the oldest son any less, or the youngest any more. He loved both equally. But the oldest son's resentment blocked him from having the fullness of his father's love. Nowhere in the story does it say that the father treated the oldest son poorly or favored the youngest. This was the story the oldest was telling himself, and he was allowing his closed mind and his pettiness prevent him from enjoying his father's love. This wonderful parable, just like the Bible as a whole, is about reconciliation. In this story, just like in step 8, all the prodigal had to do was become willing to make amends and let the rest take its course. So there you have it. 4 examples of people from the Bible who were pretty messed up, just like me, maybe just like you. People who God used, flaws and all, to carry a message of hope and reconciliation. No matter how far down we have gone, no matter what we have done, each and every one of us can be a lesson of transformation, reconciliation, and hope. Whether you have 1 day of sobriety or 50 years, we can carry the message. You may not think you have what it takes. You may think whatever you have done is so terrible that there is no way God or anyone else could love you or forgive you. When you get to thinking that and feeling that way about yourself, remember Jacob, a sexually promiscuous liar, a cheat, a thief, who spawned a seriously messed up dysfunctional family that led to the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel and ultimately to the birth of Jesus Christ. Or think of King David, shepherd, warrior, sexually immoral, lying, deceiving, adulterous, murdering king, who God called a man after his own heart, who wrote many of the Psalms, fathered King Solomon, and was an ancestor of Jesus. Or Saul, later Paul, who was persecuting Christians, converted, and still struggled with life in general, but went on to write 2/3 of the New Testament. If God can use people like that, not only to do good, but to change the world, who am I, or you, to think He can't work miracles in our lives? As for me, at times I like to look at characters in the Bible. I may be taking their inventory just a tiny bit, but it shows me that God is able somehow to love us no matter what we have done, no matter how far we have fallen. And this is just a few people. There are countless examples of how God uses our wounds to heal others. I'm just one of the walking. Your amends might be scaring you, and not doing them might be holding you back from becoming the person that God intends you to be. Think of these few people I have described, pretty messed up, all with miraculous transformations. It's comforting for me to know that I'm in good company. Please join me in step 7 prayer. My Creator, I pray that you not only forgive me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my Jesus to you in my life. Grant me strength as I draw from here to do your will. Amen. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Be safe.